And welcome to the Gay Liberation Network here on Chicago Access Network Television. I'm your host, Andy Thayer, and with us tonight is Christine Reyes Wipple of La Voz de los Debajo. Thank you very much for joining us tonight, Christine. For those who are not familiar with La Voz de los Debajo, this is a solidarity organization which has been doing yeoman's work in terms of offering aid and publicity to the struggles of people in Honduras, have been doing it since the late 90s, and have been doing a great job of it. I had the privilege to be on a couple of their delegations, and they really know their stuff. And tonight we're going to be talking about the crisis in Honduras. There's been a media blackout for the most part about some really with martial law, with police shooting demonstrators in the streets, thousands and thousands and thousands of people out in the streets, and we'll be showing you some pictures of that in a little bit. But Chris just came back a handful of days ago from Honduras. Chris, tell us what's going on in Honduras, and we've got a half hour about to do this. I know that's a huge struggle to do that.
Sure. So La Voz de los de Abajo is a Chicago-based organization. We do a lot of different political activist work, and one of the pieces we've done a lot over the last few years is solidarity work with Honduras, especially since the coup in 2009, in which the democratically elected leader, Mel Zelaya, was removed in a coup. So since that time, violence has increased. There's been political assassinations, a lot of violence against LGBT folks, activists, people who are defending the land, indigenous rights organizers. So we've thought it's very important to have an international presence and accompany people on their struggles, especially since the United States highly funds the military and police there. So we do have a direct role in this. So I did go with a group of 9 other people from November 23rd to December 1 on a human rights delegation to Honduras. So we knew, of course, the elections were going to be happening on the 26th, and unfortunately, historically, there's been quite a lot of violence around election time in Honduras. So the idea was that we could be witness to the events there and hopefully provide some measure of safety to some of the people we visited while we were there.
Great. And we're going to be going into that a great deal in just a few minutes, but before we do, wanted to get you some information about some activities coming up here. The Gay Liberation Network is going to be hosting a program called Stop Pinkwashing Israeli Apartheid. If you know anything about the history of Israel and the dispossession of people's lands, Palestinians' lands in Israel, it is very reminiscent of what happened in the old apartheid South Africa with the racist government there, limiting the rights and economic opportunities of the black majority. And you've got very similar things going on in the West Bank and Gaza, as well as in Israel, quote unquote, proper. Yes. And we'll be discussing that tomorrow, 2 p.m. Saturday, December 9th. But I'd also like to call your attention to who La Voz de los Debajo is. You can find out all sorts of great information about the events that Christine is going to be telling us about tonight on their website, hondurasresist.blogspot.com, and we'll be getting that website up for you a little bit later as well. So that's a great resource. But Chris, talk to us about some of the history. We had the 2009 coup that was supported by the Obama administration. Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State at the time and was probably the leading international supporter of the military coup. And this was in direct contravention to U.S. law that the United States continued to give military aid to the Honduran, what became dictatorship.
Right.
U.S. law says that you cannot give money to regimes that are installed by military coups. And it not only happened
Yes.
in Honduras, but it also happened in the Maldives, which is an Indian Ocean nation, but also in Egypt, where
Yes.
the elected government there was overthrown by a horrible dictator, and there's been hundreds and thousands of people who have been sentenced to death, and a horrible human rights tragedy. So all the horrible things that you might say about the Trump administration, and there are many, 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 including what's going on right today in Honduras, unfortunately this has been a bipartisan attack on people's rights internationally.
So Honduras, on its face, may seem like this small, impoverished country. Why should the U.S. care, right? But they have been a key ally to the United States and Central America for decades. So throughout the Cold War, Honduras was sort of the main military base for the United States, which was of course involved in the Contra War against the Sandinista government in Nicaragua, which many, many people died, lots of suffering there. Also involved in intelligence on Guatemala and El Salvador. So during all that time, there was a little bit of political uprising in Honduras, some leftist organizing, but overall they don't have the same history of civil war as some of the other countries around them have. So when Mel Zelaya came into power, he came with the Liberal Party, which historically has not been anything dramatically revolutionary, but he, for a lot of different reasons, began to change his political ideas and worked with Congress to raise the minimum wage, as well as to push forward a pending land reform law, because this is one of the leading causes of poverty in Honduras. An oligarchy, a group of 14 families, controls most of the land in Honduras.
It's one of the most economically unequal countries in the world, according to the so-called Gini Index, which explains how, especially after the 2009 coup, it became for several years the number one country in the world in terms of its murder rate.
Yes.
We talk about that with respect to the United States and Chicago and so forth, but this was the worst in the world for many years, thanks to that U.S.-supported military coup.
Absolutely. So after, to make a long story short, the oligarchy wasn't happy with these changes that Zelaya was making, and he ended up being deposed in a coup, taken out of his home in the middle of the night in his pajamas and dumped in another country.
Well, and he was taken to a U.S. military base, and the country is littered with U.S. military bases. He was taken to a U.S. military base and then flown out from there out of the country, which just shows how close the ties are.
So there were attempts for him and his supporters to get him back into office, and the coup was condemned by many other countries. But the United States, despite a sort of tepid concern in the beginning, did a about-face and suddenly started to support this regime. Even supporting some very questionable elections that were supposed to be democratic. They were boycotted by most of the social justice movements, which brought in a corrupt president, Porfirio Lobo. His son's currently in prison in the United States for drug trafficking. So there's the current president, Juan Orlando Hernandez. It was the same party as the party that was involved in this coup. A lot of business interests, a lot of wealth involved in that party. They're heavily supported by the United States because they see him as a partner against this war on drugs, and because, quite frankly, the United States wants to stop the flow of Central Americans to this country who are fleeing violence. And from the United States point of view, this is all based on drug trafficking and so on, but we do know that many people have fled due to political violence.
Instituted by the oligarchy and people just trying to make a living on the land and being forced off of it by the oligarchs in direct contravention to Honduran law oftentimes.
So absolutely. So the last year, Honduras received $14 million in military or security aid from the United States. And this is very concerning because the military and the police forces, the elite police force, the national police force, have been found guilty of torture, of murder. We know that Berta Cáceres, who was an indigenous leader fighting a dam being built on her land, or rather her people's land, was murdered in concert with military officers. There's been some people processed for this murder, or rather arrested, but still the top planners have not been identified. So the U.S. is heavily involved in supporting Juan Orlando.
Well, let's fast forward to a discussion about what's been happening in the last few weeks, but prefacing it by the last time there was a national election in Honduras. I had the privilege to be with the Lavos, and we found out only in retrospect that the National Party, Juan Dolendo Hernandez's party, stole the election largely by taking money from their nation's version of Social Security and funding it to a lot of puppet, parties that really didn't represent anyone.
Right.
Because the different parties are what oversaw the vote counts and so forth.
Yes.
They're election observers, and so if you basically buy off the election observers for most of the parties, then you can do the vote. And they were so shameless about it. They used, like, how would you like your Social Security check to be tapped so that someone could steal election? That's how bad it was last time around.
And what's particularly sad is in Honduras, as in other parts of Latin America, Social Security is really who funds the public hospitals, the healthcare system, which is already very limited, very poor, and it's just a crime to be stealing that money, taking
Right.
it away from poor people.
So we're going to get some pictures up here about what's Christine and others observed. What you're seeing here is a photograph that is taken by Matt Ginsberg-Jackal, another Lavos delegate, showing lots of people lining up to vote the last part of last month. But it was a pretty heavy scene down there, as you see about this. Tell us about what you observed, Chris, yourself.
Sure. So quickly, before I even get into that, I should say that Juan Orlando shouldn't even be standing for re-election because legally in Honduras, you're only supposed to have one term. And Mel Zelaya did do a referendum to see if they could run for a second, just to get it, feel out the people, how they feel about having presidents rerun, and that was the pretext for deposing him in the coup. Ironically, Juan Orlando then stacked the Supreme Court, fired the judges who he didn't feel were in support of him, put people from his party in there, and he was able to get this illegal allowance or law passed that saying he could rerun for election, but it's directly against the Honduran Constitution.
But they've been packing to the Supreme Court and everything to make it quote-unquote legal, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I did, on election day, we split out in different polls just to be, of course, we can't get involved, we're international observers, but just to sort of witness and document any irregularities that we witness. So, of course, there was a heavy military presence. This time there were some safeguards they put in to try to prevent some of the fraud that's happened in the past. For example, they were supposed to search people's bags to make sure they weren't bringing in cell phones into the actual booth, because in the past that was a way that fraud occurred. That, for example, the National Party or another party would pay some poor guy who just really needs the money to vote for their party, and they had to prove that they complied with that by taking a photo of the ballots.
I see.
So that was disallowed this time, but it was clear there was other machinations going on. So the poll I was at the entire time, there was a man known to be with the National Party, sat in the open area because it was at a school. He had women that were spreading out and talking to people while he was there. He was checking people's ID cards. He was making phone calls, filming. He photographed us several times. And, clearly it was sort of to put pressure on people that they had kind of strong-armed into voting for their candidates.
But then the vote count started, and the opposition, the genuine opposition, was ahead. After 57% of the vote was counted, the Supreme Electoral Tribunal said that the opposition was ahead by 5 percentage points. After 71% of the vote was counted, that same tribunal said that the opposition was still ahead by 5%, and then they stopped the vote count.
They said there was no way at that point that the Alianza contra la Dictadura, the alliance against the dictatorship, could lose. They were so far ahead. And suddenly the computers went down, there was an electronic... 36 hours later, when these computers were supposedly back online, suddenly Juan Orlando is ahead.
And this is how people responded. Talk about what you saw in terms of the demonstrations, please,
Sure.
Chris.
So there were demonstrations all over the country. We went to observe several. The first night was in Tegucigalpa. There were people, mostly young people, students, some from the university, political groups, demonstrating outside Infop, which is this sort of training institute where they were storing the ballots for counting. So people were demonstrating out there, very angry about fraud, but also very peacefully assembling. Just joyful, dancing, very hopeful that there was still some chance that the people's will in terms of the election would be respected.
And then what happened?
Well, after a couple hours, I didn't see it. I did see the aftermath. Apparently, Mel Zelaya and Salvador Nasrallah, who is the presidential candidate for the opposition, came up in a car trying to get into the parking lot there and to where the ballot counts were occurring. So some of the supporters rushed forward just to wave, and the police started throwing tear gas extensively. They started beating people back. It got pretty intense. It went on for hours. I did not see any violence by protesters in the least. And that was sort of the tone for the next few days. They cleared that entire area out, but people reassembled below, on the street below, and there continued to be extensive police and military presence.
And Chris, I'd like to say something about this particular picture, namely what this gentleman is holding in his right hand there.
Sure. So he's holding a tear gas canister. We saw many of those, and they say, I can't remember the company, but it made in Pennsylvania, non-lethal security tool is what it says on there.
And this is the point, is that Honduras really, in spite of being a very violent nation, thanks to the inequality, thanks to the violence of the police and so forth, they don't manufacture many, if any, arms down there. They're all imported from the United States.
Absolutely.
And yet you've got this flood of arms going to the United States. And there's something called the Berta Cáceres Act, which is aimed at stopping that flow of arms. This is something that activists in the United States who are concerned about what's going on can promote that with their congresspeople. We've had this endemic violence, and it's all done with U.S. arms almost.
Absolutely, and just for anyone who thinks about, oh, there's so much violence there, the Honduran people need to be protected. We've seen repeatedly that these arms are being used against activists, against civilians.
Journalists.
Absolutely,
Human
absolutely.
rights workers,
Berta
campesinos.
Cáceres, indigenous leader, recognized internationally for the work she's done. So we really, anyone with any sort of core belief in protecting human rights should oppose that there is military aid from the United States continue to flow to Honduras.
I should mention before we go any further, and sorry for not doing this early, that telephone number at the bottom of your screen, if you'd like to give a quick question or comment, it's got to be quick because we don't have a lot of time. You can call that. Our producer has just indicated that apparently that number is not working right now, so apologize about that. So you won't be able to field questions from our audience, unfortunately, tonight, Chris. The remarkable thing that I've seen in terms of pictures, and again, we're not seeing this here in the United States unless you're watching Univision or other Spanish language networks, and if you're monolingual like me, that's sort of useless. But there has been tons and tons of photographs coming up. They're just not showing up in our mainstream media. And the courage of the Honduran people, in spite of the violence by the police, in spite of the tear gas and so forth. I'd like to show people a little bit about that. People coming out despite curfew. The government has not formally called what's going on martial law, but it's de facto martial law. If you could say a few words about that, please.
So, ostensibly, because of all these protests, there were a lot of street takeovers by activists. It was widespread. I think the government started to panic. They called a state of emergency shortly after these protests started to take place. And within that state of emergency was a curfew. And the curfew required everyone to stay inside or to risk being arrested and not said, but this is what occurred, shot. And there have 11 people have died thus far because, well, I should say people defied the curfew because, you know, they are
Their
angry.
election was being stolen.
They're angry. This is their country. So people went out, and it was very beautiful. They went out and did what was called a cacerolazo. They went out with pots and pans and banged them, peaceful protest. And just for simply doing that, or even for some young people who just happened to be going outside to meet a brother or sister, peaceful activities, being outside on the sidewalk, ended up being shot and killed or severely injured.
Yeah, some 1,200 people at least that we know of have been quote unquote detained for trying to protect their own elections. We've had the figure, this was from Manuel Zelaya, the former president who was on Democracy Now! This morning, was saying that there were 11 who've been killed, but that's probably a dramatic undercount.
Yes.
Because this is, unfortunately, the authorities will try and cover this up.
Right.
And before we get too far with that, the New York Times today just reported that there are far more people killed in Puerto Rico, so during the recent hurricane, than has been reported by the government. So this is something that goes around, comes around. It's not like the United States is any innocent actor in this sort of manufacturing news about its failures and attacks on people. So
Absolutely.
Chris, in terms of what people, your conversations with people, what was the main thing that they were saying to you while you were down there?
So we went all over the country in different areas, talking to people about the election, about human rights, ongoing land struggles. People were very responsive to us as Americans, speaking out about what they're going through, of course, and human rights violations, but also doing what we can to intervene with our own government, because they understand that the U.S. has a huge amount of power and influence over the Honduran government. So, we put a call out, it's on our Facebook page, a lot of organizations are doing this, to please contact your representatives and ask them to demand that the Honduran government respect the results, the actual, there's been calls by the OAS and European Union to do a full recount of the results. And also to guarantee human rights, to respect people's constitutional rights. As well, and we've also talked to people about the Berta Cáceres Act, which is an act in the U.S. Congress right now, again, calling for the U.S. to cut off military aid. But people have been, even very humble people in rural areas have been able to talk about their experiences being violently evicted from the land, using high-tech military equipment. There's been deaths because of that. And they really just want us to let the rest of the world know what they're going through.
And this is one of the things, if those of you who are on Facebook Live, if you can share this, we're Facebook Living this for those who are watching on television. There has been such a media blackout in the English language press in this country about what's going on, and we can take a look at Congress and throw our hands up in the air and say, oh, these bunch of jerks, they're majority, Trumpistas. But we have to remember, it was when the Democrats controlled the Congress, it was just as bad, at least so far as Hondurans were concerned. And so people like Dick Durbin, people like Tammy Duckworth, need to be hearing it from people, because they may say the right words, but in terms of what they're actually doing and not making a priority of this issue, while people are literally dying in the streets of Honduras, they do need to hear about it, even if they formally signed on to the Berta Cáceres Act. They need to hear that they need to raise this as a continuing issue. This is an ongoing humanitarian disaster that's going on right now. It hasn't reached the level of, say, what we've seen in Yemen, but it seems like when these humanitarian disasters are happening within the United States field of view, there's very little media about it, and there's all sorts of excuses made for what governments are doing because they're United States allies.
So just a few days ago, Rex Tillerson signed off on the Honduran military aid package. So every year they have to certify that the country receiving the aid is not committing human rights violations. And he signed off on this 2 days after it was known that there was probable fraud in the election. So that's now been rubber stamped. It's going to the Appropriations Committee, on which Patrick Leahy is a member of, and he claims he's going to try to hold it up, but you know, it's pretty much been routinely refunded every year. So that's our tax dollars. We're paying for that. We're in an era where there's been budget cuts for schools. I'm a social worker. You know, so many services that people used to have no longer have, supposedly because we can no longer fund them. And we're spending millions on killing other people in Honduras.
The United States is by far the largest arms exporter in the world, by far, bar none. And the United States spends as much on its military as almost the rest of the world
Yes.
combined. One thing, we are not just fortunately dependent on what happens with the Berta Cáceres Act or the machinations of this government or the goodwill,
Yes.
I say in heavy quotes, of this government or the Honduran government, because the Honduran people themselves have been demonstrating and protesting at such a ferocity that they've caused some cracks in the regime. And I'd like to end with this. There's a section of the military security apparatus, I can't remember the name of it, you know it, I'm sure, far better than I do, Chris,
Cobras, yeah.
that has said we refuse to be used to put down our own people anymore. And we'll see how that rolls out in the next several days, but that is an incredibly promising development. Unfortunately, we are out of time here. Thank you so much, Christine Reyes Wipple of La Voz de los Debajo, and we're going to get their website up here so you can get in contact, get some decent information, because unfortunately the mainstream press is giving us precious little. And also, just a reminder that we have got the forum on Stop Pinkwashing of Israeli Apartheid coming up tomorrow. Please check that out, 2 p.m. Saturday at the Uptown branch of the Chicago Public Library. And with this, I wish you adieu, and thanks to all who made tonight's program possible, our good friends here at CAN TV, Christine Reyes Whipple. This is Andy Thayer saying good night.